The Mogollon Rim in the New Mexico territory doesn't forgive you for wandering alone. It's a place of pine shadow and stone drop-offs that don't announce themselves, of wind that speaks in a language only old bones understand. In the autumn of 1883, a young rancher named Wade Garrett was pushing through that country on a routine supply ride when he heard a sound he would never fully forget. It wasn't the roar that got to him first. It was the silence that came just before it. The way every bird in those trees stopped at exactly the same moment. What Wade Garrett did in the next 3 minutes would put him on a path that changed the entire shape of his life, because somewhere in the timber ahead, a young Apache woman named Desta was fighting a grizzly bear with nothing but a cedar-handled knife and the desperate certainty that she was about to die. What began as an act of violence in the pines between man and bear became something neither of them had any name for, a fragile trust built in a one-room cabin, a language learned in whispers by firelight, a gift left on a pine plank before dawn that Wade Garrett would carry for the rest of his days. But before any of that, there were her people, searching for her. And there were men in the valley below who wanted to make sure they never found her at all. Watch till the end, and don't forget to like and subscribe. The autumn of 1883 sat over the Mogollon Rim country like a held breath. The aspens had already gone gold, and the pines were dark against a sky the color of hammered iron. Wade Garrett was 29 years old, lean and square-jawed, with steady brown eyes that took in country the way a man reads a map. Quick, methodical, nothing wasted. He ran a modest spread in the foothills, east of Reserve, New Mexico territory. 40 head of cattle, a mule named Patience, a dog named Chalk that had died the previous winter, and a house that had room for a family that was never going to arrive the way he had once imagined it would. Wade had not set out to be alone. 3 years before, a fever had come through the valley in the back of a freighter's wagon and never left. His wife, Margaret, had lasted 11 days from the first complaint of headache. She was 24. They had been married 14 months. He buried her under a juniper on the east slope of the property, where the light lasted longest in the evening, and he went back to running the ranch the way a man keeps walking after a bullet has found him. By refusing to stop, he had not grieved loudly. He grieved the way the land grieved drought, from the inside out and over a long time. The neighbors to the south, the Hatch family, had tried a few times in the first year to bring women past for dinner. He had been polite, also quietly, unmistakably clear that there was no space being held open. He worked the ranch hard. He read by lamplight. He made the supply run to the trading post at the base of the rim 4 times a year, and he came back and was satisfied to hear nothing but wind and cattle for weeks at a stretch. The morning of October the 14th, he loaded Patience with flour, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, and a roll of tarred rope, and headed north and west along the rim trail, cutting through the high timber the way he always did on the return leg. There was a particular stretch of pine forest up there, tight-needled and dark, where the trail narrowed to a single track and the ground was soft, with decades of dropped needles. Mule and rider moved through it quietly. He smelled the bear before he heard it. That was the thing people never understood about grizzlies in that country. The musk came first, a thick animal smell with nothing domestic to compare it to. Wade's hand went to the stock of the Winchester. He pulled Patience to a stop and stood in the stirrups. Then the roar came. It was nothing like the sound a grizzly makes in a story, not dramatic in the way that a man in a warm house could make it sound later. Simply enormous. a pressure wave of sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once and hit the body before the ears properly caught it. Patience lurched sideways and Wade stepped down fast, keeping his grip on the reins with one hand and clearing the Winchester with the other. He need to move toward it. He would wonder later why he moved toward it rather than away. The best answer he could come up with was that there had been no thought involved. He heard a human sound inside the roaring, thin and defiant, not quite a scream, and his body was already moving before any part of his mind had agreed to the plan. What he found in the small clearing 40 yards from the trail stopped him for half a second. She was young, on her feet, barely, her left arm up in a defensive position, blood running dark from a tear across her forearm. The bear, a mature female grizzly, 300 pounds or better, dry season, lean and furious, had come up on its hind legs between the young woman and the tree line. She had a knife in her right hand, cedar-handled, with a bone-white blade held in the low grip of someone who knew how to use it. She was not running. She was standing her ground in a way that made her look both terribly small and entirely certain. Wade Garrett raised the Winchester and fired. Not at the bear, not yet. He fired into the pine trunk 3 feet to the left of the animal and shouted at the top of his voice, because the first rule of grizzlies in close country, the one old Abe Hatch had drilled into him 7 years ago, was that you did not take the shot unless you were certain. A wounded grizzly in timber was a death sentence. The report cracked across the clearing, and the grizzly dropped to all fours, swinging its enormous head toward this new noise. Wade worked the lever and put a second round into the ground in front of the animal's 4 feet. He shouted again, waving his hat with his left hand, the Winchester raised in his right. The bear flinched, swung its head back toward the woman, then back toward Wade. For 3 full seconds nobody moved. Then the bear huffed, a sound like a bellows, and turned, and went into the tree line at a walk that was somehow more frightening than a run. They could hear her crashing through brush for a long time after she disappeared. Then silence fell back down over the clearing like a curtain. Wade stood with the Winchester still up. His hands were shaking. He had not noticed until now. He turned to look at the young woman. She had not moved. She was watching him with eyes that were completely still, dark and serious, and giving nothing away. She was in her early 20s, striking in her features with high cheekbones and black hair that had come loose from its braid. She wore a deerskin dress with geometric beadwork at the hem and collar, Chiricahua work, though Wade did not yet know enough to recognize it as such. The cut on her forearm was ugly, wide, still bleeding freely. But it was the blood below her waist that told the real story. A slash across her outer thigh had soaked through the fringe of her dress and was pooling now at her moccasin. Wade lowered the rifle slowly. He held up his left hand, open and empty, palm out. She did not move. Her knife hand did not drop. He said, in the only Athapascan word he knew, which he had learned wrong from a mescalero man at a trading post years ago. Nt. He was trying to say, Apache people. He was not sure what she made of it. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She looked at his raised hand. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the blood running down her own leg, and something in her face changed. Not fear exactly, a rapid calculating look, the look of someone doing urgent arithmetic and not liking the sum. Her knees went. Wade crossed the clearing in 3 steps and caught her before she hit the ground. She struggled, weakly, but with genuine intent, and he held her weight and said over and over the only thing he could think to say, "Easy, Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." He wasn't sure she understood a word of it. He kept his voice at the register a man uses with frightened horses, and he held her carefully, and after a moment the struggle stopped because it had to. She simply did not have the strength for it anymore. He got her onto patience. It was not graceful. The mule was agitated from the bare smell, and the young woman was only half conscious and did not cooperate the way a conscious person would have. Wade got her draped belly down across the pack, secured the Winchester, and led Patience by the reins through the timber at a walk, keeping his eyes on the tree line, 4 miles back to the cabin. He covered them in just under 2 hours, and by the time he got her through the door, the light in the sky had gone deep amber. He laid her on the rope bed in the back room, his room, the only bed, and he assessed the damage. The arm was manageable, the thigh was not. It had been clawed rather than bitten, which was the better of 2 bad options, but it was deep and ragged and had not stopped bleeding. Wade had a small kit of medical supplies, the kind a man keeps because he is 20 miles from the nearest doctor and has cattle that do not check their footing before a fence post falls. He cleaned the wound with carbolic solution and packed it with clean rags and said words he had not said since Margaret died. Then he sat on the floor next to the bed and waited to see if she would last the night. She lasted the night. She was awake before he was, when Wade came out of the front room chair where he had finally fallen asleep. Near 3 in the morning, he found her standing in the doorway of the back room, leaning against the frame, with her weight on her good leg, watching him. The cedar-handled knife was in her hand, not raised, just held. The way you hold something when you're not yet sure whether you'll need it. He stopped moving. She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was thin and gray through the window behind him, and in it he could see she was pale from blood loss and hurting, but alert. Fully, carefully alert. Her dark eyes moved around the room, the door, the window, his hands, the rifle by the wall, and came back to him. He said, "I'm going to get water, coffee. You understand coffee?" He made no move toward the rifle. He moved instead toward the iron stove, slowly, and she watched every movement. And he built up the fire and set the water pot on and kept his back to her, because presenting his back to someone holding a knife was, he decided, less threatening than keeping his eyes fixed on her. He heard the small sound of her weight settling, not to the floor, but onto the bench by the door. She was choosing her position. She put herself where she could see both doors. He understood, without any common language to confirm it, that she was not going to run yet because she couldn't. She was not going to trust him yet because that would have been foolish, and she was clearly not a foolish person. He poured 2 cups and set one on the far end of the table and backed away, and after a long moment she took it. That was how it started. Her name was Desta. He did not learn it until the 3rd day, when she was strong enough to point to herself and say it clearly, watching him repeat it back until he had the sound right. He told her his name, and she tried it twice, Wade, and used it without hesitation from that point on. She had that kind of mind, quick and accurate and organized in ways he could only partially perceive. She was Chiricahua Apache, from a band whose main camp was 4 days north through the Rim country, near the headwaters of the Black River. He pieced this together from her gestures, her pointing at the sun, her drawing a rough line of mountains in the dust of the cabin floor. She had been on a solo herb-gathering trip, 3 days out, standard for the healers of her band, women who moved alone through the backcountry, to collect what could only be found in specific seasons, in specific places. The bear had come from upwind. That was the bad luck of it. She had not known it was there until it was 10 yards out. She was a healer, That became clear quickly, and in a way that left Wade somewhat humbled. On the fourth morning, he was cleaning the wound on her thigh when she watched his technique for about 30 seconds, and then, firmly and without apology, took the cloth from his hand. She looked at the wound carefully, then looked around the cabin and pointed at its specific things. The clay pot, the dried sage hanging from the rafter. She pointed outside and made a gesture he interpreted after a moment as asking about specific plants. He brought her his coat, and she limped to the cabin door and surveyed the slope behind the house, then pointed at a cluster of plants near the fence line that he had always taken for weeds. She said a word he could not parse, said it again more slowly, then gave up on language and walked to the plants and pulled 2 of them, roots and all. Inside, she boiled the roots in the clay pot and made a paste and applied it to the wound herself, and when she was done, the inflammation that had been worrying him for 2 days had measurably reduced by the following morning. He started paying closer attention after that. She was meticulous. She cataloged the herbs in the cabin without appearing to catalog them. A glance at the shelf, a pause at the window box where Margaret had once grown kitchen herbs that Wade had kept alive from a sense of duty he couldn't quite name. She identified 2 plants there with medicinal value she seemed genuinely interested in. She showed him, with careful gestures and the patience of someone who had spent her life translating across understanding, what each plant was good for. He had a mild infection in his left hand that had been bothering him for 2 weeks. A puncture wound from a wire repair, gone slightly wrong. He had not mentioned it. She noticed it on the 2nd day and said nothing. And on the 5th day, she made a poultice without being asked and set it beside his coffee cup and looked at him once, very briefly, then looked away. He applied it without comment. By the following morning, the infection was clearing. They built their shared language the way you build a fence line, 1 post at a time, checking each one for whether it held weight before moving to the next. He learned the Chiricahua word for fire first, then water, then horse. She learned ranch vocabulary in English. Cattle, fence, well, cold. She was faster at his language than he was at hers, which did not surprise him once he had watched the way her mind worked. She had a patience with his clumsy pronunciation that was entirely without condescension. At night, they sat on opposite sides of the fire, Desta on the bench by the door, Wade in the rawhide chair, and he read aloud from the only book in the cabin, a water-damaged copy of a translated collection of Greek stories that a school teacher from Socorro had left behind 3 years ago. He did not know why he started doing it. The silence had weight that needed something to lean against, maybe. He would read a page or 2, and she would watch the fire, and occasionally she would say a word from the story, repeat it, test its sound, and he would tell her what it meant. The knife stopped appearing in her hand by the end of the 1st week. He noticed its absence. The way you notice the absence of a sound that has been present so long, it became part of the background. He noticed other things too, in the way you try not to notice them, because noticing leads somewhere you have been careful to close off. The way she moved through the cabin, precise and unhurried, using space as though she had always understood exactly where her body was in relation to everything around it. The way she laughed, he only heard it once, in the 2nd week, when Patience stuck her head through the window over the wash basin and stole a dried apple off the sill, and the sound of it was so sudden and unguarded that it knocked something loose in Wade's chest that he immediately tried to replace. He began leaving her coffee in the mornings, without being asked. She began repairing things without being asked. The split leather on the near chair's arm. A cracked board in the window frame, she filled with pine pitch she rendered from the trees on the slope. She found a clay deposit near the back fence that had good mineral content in the soil around it. She explained this over a 10-minute conversation involving drawn diagrams in ash on the hearthstone, and she made a better wound paste from it and taught him step by step how to replicate it. On the 9th day, she asked him, with words and gestures, about the juniper tree on the east slope. He told her. It took a while because his vocabulary for grief was not one he had developed in any shared language. He told her his wife had died there 3 years ago, and that he visited the tree when the light was right in the evenings. Desta sat with this for a moment. Then she told him something in return, more Chiricahua than he could follow, but with enough gesture that he understood the shape of it. Someone she had lost too. A younger brother, he thought, though he wasn't certain. A long illness. He did not press for details. He simply received it, and they sat with both losses between them, neither trying to fix the others, and after a while Wade got up and put more wood on the fire, and Desta moved to the chair instead of the bench, the first time she had done so, and they listened to the fire until they were both ready to sleep. Something had shifted, and neither of them remarked on it. She could walk without the limp by the 12th day. He watched her move to the corral in the morning to look at his 3 horses, 2 working quarter horses, and a young bay mare he was still breaking. She moved among them with authority. The young bay, which had been nervous since the day he bought her, dropped her head and blew softly against Desta's hand on the 3rd or 4th visit. He would not have believed it if he had not seen it. She told him the mare's problem, that she had been hobbled early and was afraid of having her hindquarters controlled in a mixture of Chiricahua and English, demonstrating with her own body, showing him the mare's weight shift, the way she leaned away from pressure on her flank. She told him what to do about it. He spent 3 days doing it, and by the end the mare was standing quietly for a blanket thrown across her back. He did not stop to wonder during those days what exactly was happening. He was a practical man. There was work to do, and doing it alongside someone, alongside Desta specifically, with her particular brand of quiet, focused competence, was simpler than doing it alone. That was what he told himself. If he had been honest, he would have said the cabin felt different in the evenings. The stove had always kept it warm enough. This was something else, as though the volume of things left unsaid in a room could change its actual acoustics, and those 14 days had cleared some of it out. He left coffee out for her every morning now. She left the kindling box filled every evening, which she had started on the 6th day when she noticed he always forgot. There was one afternoon in the 2nd week that Wade thought about for a long time afterward. He had been working on the fence line along the south pasture, replacing posts that had rotted out over the summer. It was the kind of work that takes all day and rewards you with sore hands and a feeling of having done something real. He came back to the cabin at dusk to find a fire built up, a pot of something on the stove that smelled like nothing he could identify, but turned out to be a stew made from dried venison from his stores and several kinds of plant material he could not name. The cabin itself was swept and settled in a way that it had not been since Margaret. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at all of it. Desta was at the table sorting plants. She was always sorting, cataloging, organizing the small world of what was useful around them. She looked up at him, and then back at her work, and said in the easy mix of both languages they had been building together, "The stew needs 10 more minutes. Wash your hands first." He washed his hands. He sat down. He ate the stew, which was unlike anything he had made for himself in 3 years, and was, he decided, the best thing he had eaten in at least that long. He said so. Desta looked pleased in the particular way she had of looking pleased, not broadly, not demonstratively, but with a small, precise satisfaction, the way a craftsperson looks when a piece has come out right. She asked him about the fence. He told her which posts had gone bad and why: soil moisture, the wrong wood, posts set by the previous owner who had not thought about drainage. She asked questions that surprised him with their precision. She told him that her grandfather had built enclosures for horses, using a method that oriented the posts to account for prevailing wind direction, which reduced the rutting on the windward face. She drew it in ash on the hearthstone the way she always drew things when language fell short. He studied it. He asked a question. She answered it. He asked another. They talked about fence posts for an hour. Wade Garrett would remember it later as one of the cleanest hours of his adult life. If you are still with Wade and Desta at this point in the story, you already know something important is building here. Stay with it, like and subscribe, so the rest of the story finds its way to you, and don't miss what comes next. There were harder moments too, in those middle weeks, moments where the difference between them was not a thing that could be smoothed over with patience and goodwill, but a solid thing, requiring a different kind of navigation. One morning he came inside to find her standing at the shelf where he kept Margaret's things: a small tin box, a hairbrush, a Bible with a pressed flower inside. He had not moved those objects in 3 years. She was not touching them. She was simply looking at them with an expression he could not read. He said nothing. He poured coffee and set hers at the far end of the table, and sat with his at the near end. After a moment, she came and sat down. She said, in the quiet voice she used, "For things that mattered, you keep them where you can see them every morning." He said, "Yes." She said, "My people keep the belongings of those who have gone in a special place, wrapped, closed, not for looking at every day." Wade held his coffee. He thought about that. He said, "Which way is harder?" She said, "Both are hard. The hard is not the point. The point is what you do with it." He said, "What do you do with it?" She said, "You do what needs doing. The grief walks beside you. It does not walk ahead." Wade sat with that for a long time. Later that day, with no particular ceremony, he moved the tin box and the Bible to the shelf in the back room. He left the hairbrush where it was. He was not sure why. He did not examine it too closely. Desta said nothing about the change. She noticed it. He knew she noticed everything, but her silence on the subject was the silence of someone who understands that a thing done is more than a thing said. The evenings had their own rhythm now. After supper she cooked 3 times a week. He cooked the other nights, and both of them were quietly competitive about the results. They would sit by the fire, and she would work with her hands, usually the kind of fine bead work or quill work that the Chiricahua women produced for ceremonial use and trade, and he would read, sometimes aloud. Sometimes she would put down her work and listen more directly, and once she stopped him mid-sentence to ask what fate meant. He thought about it. He said it was the idea that things were going to happen to you, whether you chose them or not. That some people believed the shape of a life was already decided. She considered this. She said her understanding of the world was different. That a person did not have a fate so much as obligations. To their family, to their band, to the land that fed them. Those obligations shaped what choices were open to you. But the choices were still yours. He said it sounded like a more useful belief. She said, "Does useful matter if it is not true?" He said, "I suppose that depends on whether you can know the difference." She looked at the fire for a while and then said, "I think sometimes you cannot. I think sometimes you only find out which belief was true by living long enough to look back." Wade put the book down. He looked at her in the firelight, this extraordinary, precise, serious young woman who had survived a grizzly bear and 15 days of uncertain recovery in a stranger's cabin and was now discussing the nature of fate over a dying fire in New Mexico territory, and felt the full peculiarity of the world, which was sometimes astonishing, and sometimes terrible, and sometimes in a one-room cabin in the high pines, both things at once. He said, "I'm glad you're here." He had not planned to say it. It was simply true, and it came out. Desta looked at him. Her expression was the one he had come to think of as her considering face. Open, careful, giving itself time. She said after a moment, "I know." It was the same economy of language she brought to everything. She said, "I am glad also." The season was turning hard by the end of the second week. The aspens along the creek had gone completely gold, and at night the temperature dropped fast enough that you could see your breath inside the cabin until the stove got going. Desta had been watching the sky in the mornings with an attention that Wade came to understand as a kind of reading. She could see weather coming in the behavior of the high clouds and the quality of the light on the eastern ridgeline in a way that he had developed partly over years, and she had learned from people who had been making the same assessment for generations. She said one morning, standing at the window with her coffee, "Snow in 4 days, maybe 5. He said, "Early for it." She said, "It will not be a deep snow, but the pass will be difficult." He did not ask which pass she was thinking of. He was beginning to understand the shape of what was coming, and he did not feel the need to name it aloud. She had been well enough to travel for nearly a week. They both knew this. Neither of them had raised the subject for different reasons, or perhaps the same reason. Wade could not always tell any more where his reasons ended and where her presence had begun to affect the weather of his thinking. He checked the cattle that morning and came back to find her outside, standing at the fence line of the corral with the bay mare. She had the mare's head in both hands, forehead to forehead, speaking to her in Chiricahua in a voice too low for Wade to hear from 20 yards. The mare was absolutely still. He stopped at the cabin door and watched them for a long while. When Desta came in for coffee, she said, "She will be a good horse for you." "She's not afraid now. She was only afraid before." Wade said, "You fixed that." She said, "She fixed it. I only told her she was allowed to." They were in the third week when the first rider came. Wade saw him from the south window in the mid-morning, a single horseman moving along the lower trail from the direction of Reserve, slow and deliberate. Not a man in a hurry to get somewhere, a man looking for something. Wade watched him without moving. The rider stopped where the trail crested the ridge that gave a view of the cabin. Wade turned and found Desta already in the doorway of the back room, watching through the window he had not noticed she could see from. Her expression was quiet and unreadable, but he recognized something underneath it now that he would not have recognized 3 weeks ago. Not fear, but a particular stillness that was its own kind of readiness. "Do you know who he is?" Wade asked. She shook her head, but her eyes did not say the same thing her head did. He went out. He kept his hands visible and his posture easy, and he walked to the fence line and waited. The rider came down the trail, a stocky man in a canvas coat with a deputy's badge that might have been official and might have been purchased from a trading post. Wade could not tell at that distance. He pulled up at the gate. "Name's Greer," the man said. "Deputy out of Reserve. You seen any Apache in this country past few weeks?" Wade looked at him. "Cattle country up here," he said. "I see more bear than people." Greer looked at the cabin. "Got a report there was a woman Apache hurt somewhere on the rim a couple weeks back. People looking for her." "Her people?" Wade asked. "Or other people?" The deputy did not answer that directly. He looked at the cabin again. "If she's here, best to know it. Lot of men been riding that rim trail since early October. Not all of them looking for her welfare." Wade held his gaze. "I'll keep an eye out." Greer held the look for 3 seconds longer than was casual. Then he touched his hat and turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Wade went inside. Desta was at the window. She had watched the whole exchange. "He will come back," she said. Her English was startlingly clear when she chose to use it fully. She had been using it selectively, he realized, showing him what she needed him to know. "He might," Wade said. "Not he," she said, and pointed south. "Others." That night, Wade sat awake by the cold fire well past midnight. He was thinking about what Desta had said and not said, and about the particular quality of her face at that window. Not helpless, not waiting, but calculating, working a problem, planning. She came out of the back room around midnight and found him at the table and sat on the bench without speaking. They kept company in the dark for a while. She said, "My people look for me also," he said. "I know. They come from the north. Those men come from the south." She paused. "You are between." Wade said, "I know that too." She was quiet. Then she said, "Wade, in the morning, I make something for you." She used the Chiricahua word first, and then the English word slowly, making sure he had it. "A gift, so you do not forget what the next day's cost." He did not know what she meant. He said he would see her in the morning. He slept 2 hours. On the 15th morning, before sunrise, he woke to find a small object on the pine plank beside his bed, placed there with the precision of someone who did not make mistakes about placement. It was a medicine bundle, the kind the Chiricahua call a yin bundle, made from a section of deer skin he did not recognize. Not from anything in the cabin, which meant she had carried it with her from the beginning, through the bear, through everything. It was folded around a small, carved piece of juniper, a twisted sprig of dried sage, and a strip of braided grass tied with a red thread. She had drawn a mark on the deerskin in charcoal, a simple design, 2 lines curving toward each other, touching but not crossing. He held it in both hands in the dark. He did not fully understand what it meant until she explained it at breakfast, in more English than she had used at once before, with Chiricahua words for the parts that did not translate. The bundle was a thing a healer made for someone who had faced death on behalf of another person and survived. The juniper was for protection on trails ahead. The mark meant something close to a debt acknowledged, a bond recognized, a life given back. It was not a small thing to give. She had not given one before to someone outside her band. Wade sat with the bundle in his hands across the breakfast table from her, and did not say anything, for what she later told him was a very long time. Then he said, "I don't have anything to give back that's worth that." She looked at him steadily and said, "You already did." They heard the horses at mid-morning. Not one rider this time, multiple. Coming from the south, and also from the north, a sound Wade caught late. He was at the window with the Winchester before he fully registered that he had moved. Desta was beside him, looking out the glass with the same calm, urgent attention. "Your people," Wade said, watching the northern riders. "And his," she said, watching the south. The men from the south were 5 in number, which was too many for a welfare check and not enough for a proper posse. They had the look of hired men, not deputies, not soldiers, but the kind of organized freelancers the territory produced when land pressures and federal policy created a market for removal work that outran what the actual law would officially sanction. Wade had seen their type before. He had hoped not to see them here. He counted the northern riders. 7. They moved differently, quiet, controlled, spread wide, reading terrain with the ease of people who had been born to it. He had perhaps 3 minutes. He turned to Desta. "You need to go out the back," he said. "Now, The North Riders, they're yours. My band. She was already assessing the distance. But if those men see me run? I'm not asking you to run, Wade said. I'm asking you to walk out the back door and toward the slope, and let your people come to you from that side, slow, like it's your land, because it was. She looked at him. He said, I'll keep those men talking long enough. She said very quietly, Wade, they may hurt you. He said, they may try. He picked up the Winchester and looked at her directly for the first time in a while, not at her wound, not at the plants she was working with, not past her at a problem they were jointly solving, but at her. And he held her gaze for a moment that had no category in either of their cultures for exactly what it was. He said, Go. She went. She paused at the back door just briefly and looked back at him with an expression he had no word for. Then she was outside and moving across the south slope with a deliberate, measured walk, a healer returning from a gathering trip, if you did not know what to look for. If you were watching from the north. Wade went out the front door. He stood on the porch with the Winchester across his arm, not raised. The 5 men from the south pulled up 50 yards from the gate. Their leader was a man in a gray coat who held himself with the easy confidence of someone who was very rarely told no. Ranger, the man said, though he wore no ranger's badge. Rancher, Wade said, we're looking for a woman. A lot of men seem to be looking for an Apache woman up here, Wade said. Nobody seems too interested in explaining exactly why. Relocation purposes, the gray-coated man said. She's a ward of the federal territory. That's a big word for a small justification, Wade said. You got paperwork? The man's eyes moved to the cabin behind Wade. She here? She's not, Wade said. That was true. She wasn't inside anymore. From the north, one of the Chiricahua riders had crested the ridge and seen Desta on the slope. Wade could hear it in the sudden change of sound from that direction, voices calling, the shift in hoofbeats. The gray-coated man heard it too. He looked north and then back at Wade, and his face went through a series of small adjustments that Wade watched with professional attention. You harbored her, the man said. I found a wounded woman in the backcountry and gave her medical care, Wade said. I'd have done the same for any man, woman, or child. He kept the Winchester level and easy. You want to tell me there's a law against that? You're going to need better paperwork than whatever you're carrying. The man looked at the rifle. He looked at Wade's face, which was neither angry nor afraid, just steady, the way a man is steady when he has made a decision he is at peace with. He looked north again at the sound of horses and voices from the ridge. He looked at Wade for one more moment. Then he pulled his horse around, said something short to his men, and they rode south. Wade watched them until they were out of sight before he let the rifle barrel drop. He turned around. Desta was at the ridgeline, 30 yards above the slope, with 2 Chiricahua men on horseback beside her. She was upright, unhurt, speaking to them. One of them, an older man with a serious face, kept looking past her at Wade. After a moment she turned and looked down the slope at him. The distance between them was not great, but it was the length of 2 different worlds and all of the difficult history that had been hammered into that space. And they stood on opposite sides of it and looked at each other in the clear morning light. He raised his hand, she raised hers. Then she spoke to the men beside her, and they rode north, and Wade went inside and sat at the table for a long while. He told himself it was done. He told himself it was the right outcome. He ran the ranch for 8 days, as though the world had simply resumed its prior shape. He did his work. He slept. He was convincing nobody, least of all himself. On the 9th morning after she had gone, a sound outside the cabin woke him before dawn. He came up from sleep with his hand on the rifle before he was fully awake, old instinct, and then lay still and listened. Hoofbeats. One horse, moving easy. He went to the window. Desta was at the gate. She was on a good Chiricahua pony, dark gray, with her equipment and her medicine bundles properly arranged for travel. She was not alone. One of the men from the ridge was 30 yards back, waiting at the tree line, patient, giving her distance without abandoning her entirely. She did not look like someone uncertain about where she was or what she was doing. Wade dressed and went outside. She looked at him from the horse with the same expression she had given him through the cabin glass on the morning after the bear, direct and considering and giving nothing away unnecessarily. She said, "The men from the south. They have gone to the agency office in reserve," he said. "I expected they might." "They will bring back a letter," she said, "which will bring soldiers." He said, "I know." She said, "My band moves north in 2 days. We will be gone before the soldiers arrive." He nodded. She looked at him. He looked at her. The October light was very clear and cold, and in it she was exactly herself, beautiful and serious and in full possession of her own life. A healer who had healed. A woman who had survived a grizzly and a 15-day recovery and 5 men on horseback and come back of her own will, on her own horse, with a man from her band, waiting 30 yards back in the trees. She said, "You could come." Wade Garrett heard it. He did not answer immediately, which was, as it turned out, its own kind of answer. He said, "I've got 40 head of cattle." She said, "I know." He said, "And a ranch I've been building for 6 years." She said, "I know that also." He said, "Desta." He stopped. He looked at the juniper on the east slope, and back at her, and he said what was true in the only way he knew how to say true things, directly and without decoration. "I don't think you're offering to take me away from this country. I think you're offering to come back to it." Desta looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved, a settling like water finding its level. She said, "The Chiricahua do not make that offer to someone from outside the band." She glanced back at the man waiting in the trees, who was looking at the sky with elaborate patience. "He thinks I am saying goodbye." Wade said, "What are you saying?" She said, "I am asking if you understand what the bundle means, what I told you it means." He said, "A debt acknowledged, a bond recognized." She said, "A life given back, and a life perhaps begun." Wade Garrett had spent 3 years being careful not to want anything from the world beyond what was reliable and contained and already proven to be survivable. He had built that life with deliberateness and quiet suffering, and he had been, by some narrow definition, sufficient. He looked at the woman on the gray horse in the clear autumn light and thought about the kindling box that had been full every morning for 2 weeks, and the mare that dropped her head into Desta's hand, and the sound of laughter he had heard once by the wash basin, and the bundle of juniper and sage on the pine plank before dawn, and the particular quality of the firelit evenings, when silence had stopped being a thing he was merely enduring. He said, "Your band would have to know me," she said. "Then you would have to be known." He said, "That will take time." She said, "I know. I am a patient woman. The best healers always are." Something that had been still in Wade Garrett's chest for 3 years moved. Not dramatically, not like a log cracking in a fire, more like the sound the land makes in early spring, when the freeze finally goes out of the soil, quiet, deep, and entirely final. He said, "Ride north. Tell them to wait on breaking camp." She looked at him for one more moment, confirming something in his face, or confirming something in her own decision that had been waiting for him to make his. Then she nodded once, with a simplicity that was itself a kind of ceremony. She turned the gray pony north. Wade Garrett went inside and banked the fire and put his few important things in a saddlebag and went out and saddled the bay mare, who stood still and quiet under his hands. He took one last look at the east slope, at the juniper in the morning light. Then he rode north, following the tracks of Desta's pony in the soft October ground. They married the following spring, when the aspens were coming back along the Black River in a Chiricahua ceremony that Wade did not fully understand and took completely seriously. Desta's father, a man of considered dignity who had watched Wade split wood for the winter camp for 3 months before saying the first word to him directly, gave a speech in Chiricahua that Desta translated for Wade afterward, word for careful word. It was not a short speech. It contained the history of the band and the obligations of a man who married into it, and a great deal about juniper trees and what they meant to the Chiricahua as a symbol of endurance in difficult places. Wade told Desta later that it was the finest thing he had ever heard. She told him her father said the same thing about him. The Dayanin bundle stayed on the pine plank beside the bed for the rest of Wade Garrett's life. He would see it every morning when he woke, in the cabin he rebuilt twice over the years. Always the same plank, always the same morning light touching it first. The juniper and the sage and the red-threaded grass and the charcoal mark of 2 lines curving toward each other, touching but not crossing. He carried it one other time, 30 years later, in the spring of 1913, in the saddlebag on the ride to reserve, to file the deed on the expanded ranch in both their names. He was not sure exactly why he carried it that day. He was a practical man. He had always been a practical man. But some things are beyond the reach of practicality. Some things you carry, you learn what they mean, and then one morning you wake with the light on them and understand that they are not a record of something that happened. They are a record of who you became. If this story found its way to you today, perhaps the next one is already waiting. Like and subscribe so you don't miss it, and tell us in the comments what part of Wade and Desta's story stayed with you.